Good evening, everyone. If you can hear me, just give me a quick thumbs up. Terrific. Okay, wonderful to see you. A few people are still logging on. It's not quite 8 o'clock. We'll give people a couple more minutes. I just put up a little fun game in the chat. If you'd like to share something that you've been reading, book, an article, anything interesting, always happy to share resources with one another and give people an opportunity to connect in more ways as we're all here on Zoom. So I'm going to put one in the chat. I just ordered a new book called Upswing by Robert Putnam. There we go. That's my book. So no pressure. If there's something that you've seen, even if you don't remember the whole title, just punch it in. Everyone is muted, but I also set up things such that you can unmute if you are. So if you want to ask a question or jump in with a comment at any point, please feel free to do so. We'll give people one more minute, and then we'll jump right in. Good evening and welcome to one and all. Wonderful to see you. Extra points for those whose screens, video screens are on. Wonderful to have an opportunity to do a little learning with you. If you just jumped in, I put a little exercise in the chat. I don't know if too many people have taken me up on it, but if you want to share something over the course of the next 60 minutes, something that you have read or would like to read that is of interest, perhaps of interest to this group, please feel free to share it, and it'll be to everyone's benefit. So here we are in, I think, if I'm counting correctly, about the 8th month of this pandemic, and I know that my own attention span has shrunken. I think many people's attention spans have shrunken. I was thinking of just doing a 20-minute session because maybe that's about as much as people can take. But if people are multitasking, doing other things, that's totally understandable. This is a pandemic reality. I say this by way of introduction because the course that I'm interested in sharing with you is a survey. So it's not cumulative. You can jump in and out at any time, and you'll feel like a full participant. The structure of the course is this: every week we're going to introduce and study a particular commentary on the Torah. So we'll do some history, a little background, a little biography, get a sense of the personality of the mifurash, of the author of the commentary, and then we'll use the parsha as the lens by which to actually engage the commentary. So a little theory and a little practice, a little history and a little Chumash. Tonight, I almost feel obligated to begin any such course with Rashi. So let me jump in with a little background and a little biography about Rashi. For those of you who have studied Rashi before, and I think that's just about everybody on this call, it's almost like a game. You know, can I go to a course at the shul about Rashi and learn something that I didn't know? Right? We've been learning Rashi for so long. What don't we know about Rashi? There's so many dimensions we could spend. We could spend hours and days and weeks and months just on Rashi, and that might not be enough. So what can we do in an hour? Hopefully we can do something meaningful. Again, I say by way of introduction that of course we're just scratching the surface, but as always, please feel free to jump in with questions and comments, and to the extent that something piques your interest and you'd like to know something more or looking for further resources, please just ask or text or email after the class, and I'll be happy to share those resources with you. Okay, so who was Rashi? Rashi was a man called Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, and he lived from 1040 to 1105. Okay? So if his name is Rabbi Shimon ben Yitzchak, why is he called Rashi? What should he be called? He should be called Rashbi. Thank you, Avi. I can read lips a little. He should be called Rashbi. So why isn't he called Rashbi? He's not called Rashbi because Rashbi was taken. right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is Rashbi. So we needed another name to call him. So the abbreviated form is Rashi, and that's affectionately how he's been known for the last 900 years. Rashi, as you know, was born in Troyes, Troyes, in northern France, which at the time in the 11th century was a great center of Jewish learning, but it wasn't the principal center of Jewish learning, particularly in Ashkenaz. And so Rashi, when he was a child, or probably in his younger years as a teenager, was sent to learn in the German yeshivas, and we know him as having studied and lived in Worms. So 1040 to 1105. We know some of his teachers. One of them was a man named Yaakov ben Yakar of Worms. We don't know too much about his rebbeim or his yeshiva. We know that he was an only child. He was married and had 3 daughters, all of whom were married to Talmudic scholars and people who we know as being part of the Tosafist school. What were his works? What were his great contributions? So, of course, he wrote, as we know, a commentary to Tanakh, almost the entirety of Tanakh. There's not Perish Rashi on the book of Divrei Hayamim. We have something that sometimes appears in the Tanakh and looks like Rashi. It's written probably by his students. He wrote a commentary to almost all of Shas, to the Talmud Bavli, 30 tractates, not all of Talmud Bavli, but almost all of Talmud Bavli. I'll just say as an aside, people ask, we have 2 Talmuds, the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi. And how is it that over the course of Jewish history, the Talmud Bavli became so prominent and the Talmud Yerushalmi is basically neglected? You walk into any base medrash in any city in the world, and you'll find people learning Gemara. What are they learning? They're learning the Talmud Bavli. So is there something superior about the Talmud Bavli? Why are they learning Bavli exclusively? And rarely, right, is someone learning Yerushalmi? It's a complicated question, and it's a longer answer, but one of the reasons is Rashi. Rashi wrote a commentary to the Talmud Bavli, and he opened it up so that people could understand and access the Talmud Bavli. You don't understand the text, you go to Rashi and you could understand it. You open up a Talmud Yerushalmi, and it's opaque, and you're stuck because the commentaries on the Talmud Yerushalmi, they're not going to help you. So significantly, he wrote a commentary to almost all of Tanakh and to almost all of Shas. He was also the rabbi of his city, which meant that he wasn't just hanging out in the base medrash in Ivory Tower, but he was also dealing with questions of practical rabbinics. And in questions of practical rabbinics, you record shelos and shuvos. Somebody writes to you and says, I have this query, I have this quandary, I have this issue. And the Rav writes back. And if he keeps a copy for posterity, then you can collect them and produce what we call shelos and shuvos. And that is also extant. We have around 300 shelos and shuvos that Rashi wrote. We also have books that he didn't produce himself, but that he was responsible for. So sometimes his students or students of his students wrote compendia. Like there's a book called the Machzor Vitri, which was written by students of Rashi, where they record things that he said or things that he did or halachic positions that he took. Let me just say one word about the printing of Rashi. So it's fascinating to note that the first Jewish book, the first Hebrew book ever printed, is Rashi, right? 1475 in Reggio in Italy. The first Hebrew book that's printed is Rashi. People think, Rashi was printed alongside with the Chumash. It's the Chumash with Rashi. No, the first Hebrew, it's just Rashi. Right? It was printed as an independent text, and it's just stunning to think, right, that even more popular and dare I say, right, more well known, right, than Tanakh was Rashi. If you're a publisher, you're a printer in the 15th century, and you're trying to make a buck, so you're not telling the first thing you want to sell. The first thing you want to sell is Rashi. That's how popular that's how popular his commentary was. Rashi script, just a word about Rashi script. We open up a Chumash, and the script that we find in Rashi is we call Rashi script. It's like a cursive as opposed to a block font. So why is that, right? Rashi must have written in Rashi script. So that's a mythology, okay? So Rashi wrote in the same, penmanship as you and I write, more or less. And why do we call it Rashi script? There was no publishing and no books in the 11th century. But the first time, or the first times in the 15th and 16th century when Rashi was published, to offset, right? It was a brilliant ploy in the early days of printing to offset Rashi from the core text. The publisher used a different font. So you had the text of the Chumash in the block letters, and you had this other, right, italics or cursive script that was used to differentiate the text from the core text, the commentary from the principal text, and that's why it became known as Rashi script. Let me say a couple more words of background. And then I want to say a couple things about Rashi's commentary on the Chumash specifically, and then the second half of this hour, I want to jump into the text itself. When I went back to school to study for my dissertation, I had originally thought I would study the medieval period. Right? It's so rich. I mean, you want to study Jewish history, so how could you not study the medieval period, the period of the Rishonim? It's Rashi and the Ramban and the Rambam and the Tosafos and on and on and on. The Rishonim. How could you not study the medieval period? And one of the reasons I actually decided to study the early modern period as opposed to the medieval period is that there's a real challenge when it comes to the medieval period, and that is it's so long ago that the source material is drastically limited. Okay? So if you're a scholar of the medieval period and you find 4 lines of a Tosfos in a manuscript, that's like the find of a lifetime. Right? And in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, where I work, you find manuscripts and books and unpublished material, right? And the materials are just much more expansive by orders of magnitude. So Rashi, again, 1040 to 1105. So how much of his manuscript do you imagine that we have in the year 2020? What's been preserved? If you go to the academic libraries where these manuscripts exist, how much of Rashi's manuscript do we have? Right, he wrote a Perush to almost all of Tanakh, everything except Divrei Hayamim. So what do we have? Anyone want to put yourself and take a guess?
Nothing.
I want to even say less than nothing. Okay, we have not a word, not a page, not a leaf, not a leaflet, nothing from Rashi's Perush, right from his manuscript. Okay. Now, Rashi was already famous, and Rashi's Perush was already famous in his lifetime. And we can talk a little bit about why in a minute. Rashi's Perush was already famous in his lifetime, right? This is hundreds of years before printing. So how do you get a copy of this wildly popular Perush? So there are copyists, and their job is, it's not that efficient, but you copy by hand the original manuscript, and then you make you make copies, and you can make 1, you can make 5, you can make 10, and then there's a copy of a copy, and so on. So how many second generation manuscripts do we have from Rashi's lifetime? Not that he wrote, but maybe a copy of the original from the 11th century. Nothing. Not a page, not a paragraph, not a word, not a letter. How about the next generation, right? From, let's say, the 12th century, right? A copy of a copy of a copy. 0, nothing. The earliest manuscript that we have of Rashi is from the 13th century. Okay, so we're working with, who knows, right? How many generations, copies of copies of copies. There was no critical edition. There was no attempt at a critical edition until the 19th century. What's a critical edition? A A critical edition means I take the existing manuscripts and I compare them to get the best version of the text. No one had done that until the 19th century. So when you have a 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century copy of Rashi, that's just a guy who got a hold of a manuscript with the text. He didn't check it. He didn't compare it. I'm printing the manuscript. This is what I got. It might be accurate. It might be wildly inaccurate. It might be worse than that. The person who publishes it, right, it might be perfectly accurate, and he thinks it's inaccurate. So he says, "Oh, that's not a vav. That's a tough. Let me fix it." And I published the book with a tough, and you'll never know that it was a vav because I fixed it, right? And how many errors creep into the text over generations and generations of this happening. So look, most of the time it doesn't matter. We understand what Rashi's saying, and we know the text, and there's not that much writing on it. But just important to recognize that what we're dealing with, right, is very imperfect information. So you'll see oftentimes in good editions of the Chumash, right, it'll say Nun Aleph, right, Nusach Acher. Someone is identifying that this is the text they have, but there's an alternate text and there's an alternate reading. And particularly in the case of Rashi, this happens right on every line because we have such little information from the beginning. Okay, I said Rashi is so wildly popular. Want to take a guess at the answer to the next question? There's a commentary is as we know a perush to the core text. A commentary to a commentary is called a super commentary. It's called a super commentary. So Rashi is the perush on the Chumash. If you write a commentary to Rashi, that's called a super commentary. So anybody ever hear of a super commentary on the Ramban? Maybe in the 21st century there is one. There's certainly not a known one before that. How many super commentaries are there? How many commentaries to Rashi would you imagine there are?
100.
Last count, I think, was over 300. Right? That is a staggering number, and just speaks to the enormous, almost unsayable, indescribable popularity of this text. How popular does the commentary have to be to warrant 300 right commentaries to the commentary? So it's not like, oh, Rashi is the most important, and there's the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra. No, Rashi is like orders of magnitude beyond anything. Right? So much so, the Gemara says that there's a special practice to learn Shnayim Mikra Echad Targum every week. You should review the Parsha. What does it mean to review the Parsha? You do it twice, review it once, twice, 2 times in the original text, and once in translation. The Targum they had in mind, what if the lingua franca at the time was Aramaic, whatever it was. So Unkelis is the translation. Right? So much so, right? So fundamental was Rashi that the halachic psak emerged over time that you could fulfill your obligation of Shnai Mikra Echad Targum by studying the text twice and Rashi. And that's sufficient, right, to fulfill your obligation. So fundamental is Rashi's commentary. Okay. Let me say one more thing about Rashi's background, and then I want to jump to the text. Itself. The $64,000 question, right, is why, right? What did Rashi do that was so revolutionary? What did he do that's never been replicated in the last 900 years that's allowed him to have this staying power such that he has become, right, almost inseparable from the text, right? It's Chumash and Rashi. Right? And of course, if I'm teaching on Rashi, I have to tell my favorite, and I think it's my only Rashi joke. Right, so who's the first person to learn Chumash with Rashi? First person to learn Chumash with Rashi? Rashi's father. Okay, you get it? So, okay, I mean, he wasn't learning the commentary, he was just learning with Rashi. Okay, so what's the answer to that $64,000 question? What's made Rashi survive and thrive? So I want to mention just 5 points. Okay, which really come from one of the best biographies of Rashi, certainly in contemporary times, by a man called Avraham Grossman, who's now professor emeritus. He was the former head of the history department at Hebrew U, and now well into his 80s and is retired. But he wrote a book with a catchy title. It's called Rashi. And obviously he wrote it in Hebrew, but it's recently translated. I want to say around 2012 or thereabouts. It's translated. It's excellent. If you're going to buy one book, I think it's a little expensive. These academic presses are a little pricey, but not crazy. You can find it on Amazon. If you're going to buy one book on Rashi, buy Avram Grossman's book. Excellent and easy to find. Avram Grossman, Rashi. Okay, so he suggests basically five reasons that contribute, right? And none of these answers is sufficient on its own, but five reasons that contribute to what makes Rashi so head and shoulders above everyone else. Okay. So one is its concision, the text, the commentary's concision, and its readability. Right? It's totally accessible. You're not reading reams and reams of commentary. There's a beginning and a middle and an end, and you could snap your fingers and you got through the explanation. Number one, concision. Number two, and I want to talk more about this tonight, time permitting, moral relevance, which is to say, there's a message, right? Rashi is not just explaining the meaning of the text the way that you would explain the meaning of Shakespeare in a freshman seminar in a university. Like, what does this line mean? Let me tell you. No, Rashi's telling you, right, I want to tell you what the line means, and then I want to tell you why it matters. Because we have a Masorah and we have a Jewish tradition and we have a mission in this world. And let me explain how this text is going to inform the mission of the Jewish people, the moral relevance. Third is Rashi makes the text interesting. He fills in the gaps. He cites midrashim, and we'll get to an example of this, an important example in a few minutes, that not only make the text more readable, but make the text more interesting. So much so that sometimes kids start to confuse, what's Rashi and what's the text. So, you ask a kid, how did Abraham relate to his father? And they'll tell you the story of idols, and right, that's a medrash codified, right? And I use that word, reservedly. What does it mean to codify something when you're writing a commentary? Codify, right? So that story becomes almost part of the text, such that when the Torah talks about Or Kasdim, you think that, we know the backstory. So Abraham did this and he got thrown into a fiery furnace. The text doesn't say anything about a fire furnace, it just says Or Kasdim. That's a place name. No, but Rashi makes the text even more interesting by giving you the backstory. Fourth, Avram Grossman makes a fascinating historical observation. And this comes back to what I said about Rashi's commentary to the Talmud. So we think that the Talmud's commentary predated the Tanakh commentary. The Talmud commentary was so important and so popular that it catapulted Rashi into a place of great fame, such that he basically became a bestseller. So, our question could be a little reformulated. It's like, why is this sequel so popular? Well, because the original one was really popular. So we're asking the wrong question. The sequel's popular because now we know the author and everybody wants to eat up the second book in the series. So again, it's a loose analogy, but because Rashi's commentary to the Talmud was so important and so compelling, he gained such fame that it was almost obvious that his commentary to Tanakh would become so important. There's a fifth component here, which is less tangible, but I find it very compelling and very important, and that is, I would say, Rashi's love for Hashem, for the Torah, and for the Jewish people. Part of his mission was to give comfort to a people who were not living through the easiest time, right? And for all posterity. So what's going on in the lifetime of Rashi, 1040 to 1105? Right? Name one event that happened right between 1040 and 1105. First thing comes to mind, 1096. The first crusade, right? And the first crusade didn't just appear. Things were deteriorating. Things were difficult for the Jewish people. Entire communities were decimated, right? And there's expulsions, and then what we end up calling pogroms and massacres. So to read the text, right? Rashi says, I want to give the people reading the Torah and reading Tanakh a sense of hope and a sense of purpose and a sense that, yes, these are trying times and these are difficult times and we're in the galus and this is the diaspora, but always know Hashem loves you and Hashem cares about you and Hashem wants you to be close to him. Open up, and it's really amazing. Open up and just look at the first Rashi on any book of the Torah, right? And there's a theme. I didn't put on the source sheet in the interest of time, but when you have a second, you just see Bereishis is a little harder to identify, but certainly in Shmos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devar, first Rashi, right? So Bamidbar, just taking one. So Rashi says, oh, why is God always counting the people? If you love something, you count them. You count it often. So Hashem, to demonstrate his love for the Jewish people, is always counting. And it's not just the opening Rashi on every book. It's a thread. It's a thread throughout his entire commentary. I want to add an epilogue, and it's something that I hope to have time to come back to in a few minutes. Beyond those 5 reasons, is a sixth component, which I would call the animation and preservation of Chazal, which is to say, and this is an important point of background, which is to say that Rashi was intent on preserving the Mesorah as it attaches to the text. So what Rashi is doing, and this is very important to know, Rashi is not innovating in his commentary. Rashi, by and large, his innovation is in his selection and in his omission. So what's on Rashi's bookshelf? There's no books, there's only manuscripts. But what's in his proverbial library? So the answer is everything that exists up until the 11th century, right? Which makes for a very interesting discussion point, which is to say the canon was much, much smaller in the 11th century. There were Torah commentaries, but not like Rashi's. So what does Rashi have in his base medrash, right, in his library? So of course he has all of Tanakh, right, and of course he has all of the Gemara, the Talmud Babli and the Talmud Yerushalmi, and then he has the entire corpus of midrashic literature. The thing about the Talmud and the thing about midrashic literature is that they are totally disorganized. Right? So there are compendia, but they're loose homonyms, right? What does medrash even mean? Medrash is just a catch-all, right? We say, when was the medrash written? The medrash was written from the Tannaitic period in the 1st century until you go debate the end of medrash. You could say it was still being written in the 15th century. Any rabbinic commentary, it's just a catch-all phrase, we call it medrash. So if somebody put a bunch of them together, it might have a name, and it might be called the Tanhuma, or it might be called the Medrash Rabbah, or whatever names we ascribe to them. So he has this, let's say, 1,000-year library of midrashic literature, and more recently for Rashi, Gaonic literature, and that's what is at his disposal. So part of what Rashi is doing is selecting for the reader what's the most pressing or most prevalent or most relevant rabbinic idea or comment that speaks to this text, and I want to flesh that out for you in just a minute. Okay. Rashi makes no. Just hold off on the questions, just because we're a little limited in time. Maybe we'll circle back at the end. Rashi has no introduction to his commentary. As we'll have a chance to learn in later weeks, some authors of commentaries to Tanakh give us a gift, and they say at the beginning of their book, here's my plan, here's my purpose, here's what I'm setting out to do. a little, I'd say one word about this, it's a little bit of a 21st century construct, or maybe a 20th century construct. It's not a given that somebody's sitting down in the 11th century and writing a perush on the Torah or on Tanakh was doing anything systematic. Maybe there was no system. Maybe it was learning with his chavrusa, and when they had an idea, they wrote it down and they collected their ideas and put it in a book. I don't know. How much do we know about the systematization or the systematic thinking of a particular author in the 11th century? That's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. 18, 19, in the modern times, what was an author's purpose or mission? In the 11th century, maybe they had one. I hope they had one, but maybe they didn't. So Rashi, for better or for worse, gives us no introduction to Tanakh, and no introduction to, let's say, the book of Bereshis. He does, however, occasionally share with us what scholars call a programmatic statement. A programmatic statement is a statement in which someone says something which we believe, reveals something important about their commentary. So I put out a source sheet, which went out in an email, it went out on the WhatsApp, it's on the website. If you have it, great. If not, don't worry about it. I'm going to put up a couple of sources as they're relevant on the screen. I don't like to do it too much because I prefer to see people's faces, and I think that's much nicer. But let me put up just very quickly this comment of Rashi. Okay, here you can see, by the way, it just picked one at random. This is, I think, from the 14th or 15th century, but this is what a codex looked like, where it's just Rashi, right? You pick up what was a manuscript, right, shaped like a book, handwritten manuscript shaped like a book, that's just Rashi's commentary. Okay, so if you just look at source number 2, so this is a comment that Rashi makes in Parshas Bereshis, not at the beginning, but in the 3rd chapter. And without getting into the specifics of the pasuk that he's explaining, he says, I just want to tell you, this is the end of the 2nd line in source number 2. So he says, we'll just read the whole thing. Yesh midrashe agada rabim. There's a lot of Agadic material, a lot of midrashic material. Ukvar sidrim rabbeinu al mechonam. And they've already been organized, to some extent by other rabbis. Bereshis Rabbi in that specific collection, Uvashar Midrashos in other collections. Va'ani, as for me, Rashi says, Lo bati ela lepshuto shel mikra ula'agada hamiyasheves divrei hamikra davar davur al ofnaf. So Rashi says, that's not my job. I'm not a medrash. Right? My job is to give you pshuto shel mikra, right, which you could spend a semester trying to tease out exactly what that means. We usually translate it as something like the plain sense of the verse, or the simple sense of the verse. I would actually translate, I think the best translation, it's a little self-referential, the best translation of pshat is an explanation of the text within its context without recourse to midrash. An explanation of the text within its context without recourse to midrash. So again, that famous example, to tell me Or Kasdim is a story about Abraham being thrown into a fiery furnace. Right? There's no way that that's pshat. Right? That might be the meaning of the text. Right? It could be the best explanation of the text, but it's not pshuto shel mikra. So Rashi says, my job, and we have to explore the veracity of this statement because Rashi's very fond of quoting midrashim. He says, I want to give you pshat. I want to give you the simple interpretation of the text to explain it within its context. Okay? And we'll see to what extent Rashi succeeds, so to speak, in that mission. But at least on its face, right? If you asked Rashi what he's doing in his commentary, he wants to give you a pshat commentary. His grandson, the Rashbam, took this ideal to its furthest extreme, right? And the Rashbam says, I'm not quoting Medrash. It's just not of interest to me. I'm going to write a exclusively pshat commentary on the text with zero recourse to midrash. Okay. Try that on for size. And Rashi, right? Rashi doesn't do that. Rashi's interested in the pshat, but not, as we'll see, right? Certainly not to the exclusion of medrash. Okay. So I know I've said a lot, and I've probably bitten off more than I could chew trying to do all of this in one shot. But that's okay. It's good to be ambitious, and of course, there's more time, and we can circle back at other occasions to address any or all of these issues. So I want to jump now to one of the most perplexing parts of our parsha, one of the sections that we almost surely skip in day school. We probably skip it in first grade, we probably skip it in eighth grade, probably skip it in high school. And I don't know the first time we ever start to really understand what's going on in this section. The section that I have in mind is in the ninth chapter of Bereshis. Okay, in the ninth chapter of Bereshis, after the flood, there's an epilogue. Okay, you remember the story? I'm not going to put it up on the screen. But if you have a Chumash handy, or if you have the source sheet, it's source number 3. And I just want to read the first few psukim, and then I want to learn the Rashis with you and put them in their context to see coming to life some of the issues that I've just mentioned, and to see how Rashi operates in real time, so to speak. Okay, so. Jump with me, if you will. Jump with me to chapter 9, verse 18. This parak tes pasuk yud ches. Again, it's in the source sheet. If you don't have it in front of you, don't worry about it. It'll be familiar. The Torah says the following: Vayu b'nei Noach hayotzim min hativa shem b'cham v'yapes b'cham hu avi Canaan. I'm just going to flag a few of the questions as we go, so we'll know what Rashi is doing when we circle back to them. So the Torah tells us that the people who, that the sons of Noah who came out of the Teva, they survived the flood, were Shem, Cham, and Yafes, and Cham, hu avi Canaan. Cham is the father of Canaan. So one question, right, jumps right off the page: who cares, right? Why would we have to know that? We're going to get a genealogy in a minute. We're going to know all of the, kids and grandkids. What's the relevance of Cham, hu avi Canaan? Shlosha ela b'nei Noach me'ela nafza. These were basically the three fathers of the next generation. From them, right, the world spread out. 6 words in this pasuk. 2 of them are easy to understand. 4 of them are difficult to understand. The second half of the pasuk, last 2 words, Noach planted a vineyard. But what about the first 4 words in the pasuk? Vayachel Noach. Very difficult. It may even be a hapex legam. I'm not sure if there's another expression that is exactly like this. Vayachel Noach, usually translated in a regular chumash as like Noach began, like maybe from the word lahatchil. Strange. What does Vayachel Noach mean? And ish ha'adama, that's certainly a hapex legam. That never occurs anywhere else. What's an ish ha'adama? A ground man, a man of the earth? Go know what that means. Rashi, help us out. Tell us what that means. What does he do? Vayash min hayayim vayishgar. Okay, obviously, things went very quickly. The second after he planted the vineyard, right? The Torah tells us that he drank the wine and he got drunk. Vayitgal b'soch ahalo. Vayitgal b'soch ahalo. What is vayitgal? Very unusual construction. It comes from the word, right, legalot, to reveal. What does vayitgal mean? You have to understand what that's about. And besoch ahalo, I'm saying it, but if you have the text in front of me, there's a problem with that word. The problem with that word is that it's misspelled. Ahalo should be aleph, hey, lamed, vav. He exposed himself, he uncovered whatever he did in his tent. But it doesn't say that. It says ahala, like in her tent. What does that mean? Why is it misspelled? Another question. Vayarcham avi Canaan es ervas aviv. So what's going on here? Cham, the father of Canaan, again, reminding us that he's the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. Literally or figuratively, is that a euphemism? Right? Remember in Sefer Vayikra, when we have expressions like this, they're euphemistic, right? To uncover the nakedness, it means to have sexual relations with them. So what is happening here? What is the meaning of that line? Cham saw his father's nakedness. Go know what that means. Rashi, help us. And he told his two brothers outside. ויקח שם ויפס את השמלה וישימו על שכם שניהם וילכו אחר הניס ויחסו את ארבעת אביהם. At the two brothers, right? Shem and Yafes, right? So they hear what their brother says and they take a different action and they go inside and cover their father. They're facing backwards so they don't see their father's nakedness. Noach woke up from his wine, from his drunken stupor, and he knew what his little son had done. Who's his little son? What's the birth order of these three sons? Shem, Cham, Yafet. Cham is not the little son, Cham is the middle son. So why is he called the little son? Rashi, help us. Vayomer Arur Canaan, Eved Avadim Yeh Lechav. And now Noach issues a curse. And he says, Arur Canaan. Arur Canaan. What did Canaan do? Canaan's not in this story. Canaan is the son of Cham. Noach is cursing his grandson, not aware of anything that the grandson did wrong. The son did something wrong. We don't even know what that is, but whatever it wasn't the grandson who perpetrated the crime. Why is Canaan being cursed of all people? Right? Cham has 4 kids. We're going to learn the genealogy in a minute in the next chapter. So of all the children, why is he cursing Canaan? Okay? And then in the interest of time, we'll stop there. The text goes on for another 2 or 3 verses with Noach's reactions to Shem and Yafet. So far, so good. A lot of puzzles. What does Rashi do to solve these puzzles? So I'm going to share the screen. If you have it, you can use the text, or I'm going to put up a couple of these lines for us to see. Okay. So, source number 4. V'cham hu avi Canaan. Rashi says, Lama hutzrach lomar kan. What do you need to tell me this for? Lefisha parsha asuka uba b'sichruso shel Noach shekilkel bacham. Val yado niskalkel Canaan. Canaan is important to the story because at the end, he's cursed. But we never heard of him. So it's going to be important to know who he is. So Rashi says the text is doing something very important. It's giving us the information that we're going to need in a minute. So this comes back to one of the first points I made. In the answer to the question of what makes Rashi so important and so popular, Rashi answers questions that make the text more readable. Without this comment, it's just bizarre to have the mention of Canaan in the middle of the text. Rashi makes the text more readable. Vayachel. So now what happens? Rashi says, Vayachel, what does that even mean? Asa atzmo chulin. He made himself shahaya lo la'asok tchila b'netia acheres. He did something, what do you want to say? Chol is the opposite of kadosh. He did something unholy. He did something, right? My Yiddish teacher would say vachadik, right? It's something that, is base. That's why sometimes you'll see not a bad translation, if they're interested in Rashi, is he debased himself. He did something which he shouldn't have done. Why? And now Rashi, a moral. He shouldn't have started this way, right? That's an editorial. That's a value judgment. That's a morals call. And Rashi now is going to say something more about the dangers of wine. Okay, but hold on one second. I want to open a parenthesis here. Okay. The sources from which Rashi calls are always very, very important. And you could spend a lifetime, right? It's a fascinating and super important exercise to look at what is available to Rashi and what he chooses to include. So how bad a guy is Noach in this story? Verse 20, right? Rashi's saying something critical. He did something debased. not great. Okay, if you're grading Rashi, if you're grading Noach on Rashi's scale, maybe he's getting a B minus. It's not an F. He's not a terrible guy, but it's something, right? It's not an A. And then Isha Adama, I'm still in open brackets, okay? Isha Adama, he says Adonai Adoniha Adama, Kemo Ishna Ami. I'm sorry, that's an extra letter there. Kemo Ishna Ami. Ishna Ami, right? So it means the husband of Naomi. You might say a non-politically correctly, right? The master of Naomi. So he says similar formulation here. The master of the ground. Okay. C plus, B minus. Not great, not terrible. But now I want to show you something. Okay. I want to show you what Rashi didn't say. Okay. Look at this Gemara, right? Again, Rashi had this open in front of him. He knew it by heart. He could have said exactly this comment, which the Gemara says. What is Vayachel Noach Ish Adama Vayita Kerem? So the Gemara says, source number 8, a debate. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rav Ukva, Amar Rav Ukva, Ve'amri Le'amar Ukva, Amar Rabbi Zakkai. Question of where this came from, but there's a tradition. Amar Lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Noach. God said to Noach, Lo haya lecha lilmod mi'adam harishon. You know, you didn't get the message. We had a story like this before. You should have learned your lesson. Shelo garam lo elayayin. There's a Mesorah that the Eitz Hadas was not a tree at all, but rather a vineyard. Right? The whole issue was that Adam Harishon ate from a grapevine. That's the Mesorah. And so Hashem says to Adam, what were you thinking? Right? Terribly critical of Noach. Noach, you made a terrible mistake because of all the things you could have planted. This should have been last on your list. Rashi doesn't say this. Rashi doesn't record this. Rashi records a medrash, right? That, what Noach did, he debased himself a little. Not great. Let's continue for 1 second. You ready for this? I'm going to jump around to 2 other comments. First, this one. Vayit Gal. What was that line? He exposed himself. He did something he shouldn't have done. What did he do? What's Noach's culpability here? So far, according to Rashi, a little culpability, but it's his son's fault. Rashi says Vayit Gal. What does that mean? Lashon v'yit pa'el. We would say in modern Hebrew, that's the hit pa'el. It's reflexive. So not he was exposed or he became exposed, but he exposed himself. Right? So legaleach is to shave. Lehit galeach is to shave yourself. Right? So v'yit gal is not just to expose, but to self-expose. That's what he did wrong. Okay. What's the source that Rashi doesn't quote? You ready for this? There's a medrash, source number 9. Yitgal b'toch ahalo. I'll come back in a second to what Rashi says about that word ahalo. Remember we said it's the wrong letter at the end of the word. It should have said aleph, hey, lamed, vav. So you know what the medrash says? Fall right off your chair. Yitgal b'toch ahalo. Ba l'shamesh v'nispazer zaro v'nispazer. Ahalo, right, it's ahala. He went into his wife's tent. Right? And his goal was to have sexual relations with her, except he failed. And he ended up spilling his seed and embarrassing himself and exposing himself. Wow. Well, now it's not just that he took off his pajamas. Now he's made a total fool of himself, right? And he's basically unable to function as a result of his self-intoxication. It's a terrible story. Rashi doesn't report the full extent of that terrible story, right? That took place in the midrashic imagination. Rashi gives a more sanitized version, we'll say, of the text. Rashi's not above criticizing people in Tanakh, right? This is not to whitewash the story. What I want to argue is that Rashi is preserving a very nuanced portrayal of Noah that exists from the beginning of the parsha. Right? What's the most famous Rashi on Noah? Right? We all know the famous Rashi at the beginning of the parsha. I'm sure I have it on here. I just have to find the text. So it's source number 5. Right? Tamim haya b'dorosav yesh rabbeinu dorshim oso l'shvach kol shekain she'ilu haya b'dor tzadikim haya tzadik yoser. He was great, and he's so great, and in another generation would have been even greater. Or, right, v'yesh dorshim oso l'ganai, or maybe he wasn't so great. Maybe it's a qualification. He was ish tzaddik, but tamim haya b'dorosav, only in his generation he was so great. Why? L'fi doro haya tzadik. It was all relative because people in his generation were so wicked. Look at this formulation. Not just that he would have been like an A- compared to Abraham, he would have been a 0 compared to Abraham. Rashi doesn't vote. Rashi records the debate and says, look, there's a sophisticated debate going on about who this character Noah was. Was he a good guy or a bad guy? Was he a objective tzaddik, or was he a subjective tzaddik? Right, source number 7, the same issue. The Torah says the flood started, and the Noah got into the teva. Famous Rashi, mipnei mehamabul. He went in because of the water. Af Noach mikitnei emunahaya. Wow, Noah, man of little faith. Mamin ve'enu mamin. He had some belief, but not complete belief. Shiavo hamabul lo nichnas l'teva ad shedachku hamayim. He thought maybe the flood. He only got in when the water actually started. So how much faith did he have? So Rashi has, when Rashi preserves, right, the very sophisticated portrayal of Noah in Chazal. And it's a very careful tightrope that he walks to quote sources which tell you what the text means, and at the same time preserve the way that Chazal is described in the Medrash and in the Gemara without tipping to one side, right? Another commentary could have easily come and said, reading this stream of thought in the Medrash and the Gemara, Noah is terrible. No, yeah, there is a piece of that, but that's not the entirety. That's not the entirety of the story. Let me make at least 2 more comments, and hopefully we won't run out of time before we do. I said I'd come back to the word ahalo. So you saw the Medrash, right? Rashi says a totally out of left field comment, which comes from another midrashic source. And he notes it, right? Ahalo. So he says ahalo ksiv. Right? It's misspelled. Why is it misspelled? In this text, by the way, they change it. It's normally the first word on the Rashi is a quote from the pasuk, except here I just copied this from some online Rashi. They changed it, right? What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says Aleph Hey Lamed Hey, right? And here they spell the quote as if it's with a vav. So because it wouldn't make much sense without doing that. Okay. So Rashi's explanation is ahalo ksiv, right? It says it with a hey. Remez la'aseres shvatim. You would never intuit this in a million years without this line. Remez la'aseres shvatim shenikru al shem shomron shenikras ahalo. The 10 tribes who are exiled, the 10 tribes who are lost, are sometimes called shomron, and he has psukim to back this up, and sometimes they're called an ohel, right? The tent of the Jewish people. And why are they called that? Shegalu al iske hayayin. Okay, and he quotes a random pasuk in Amos. Why were they expelled? Why were they lost? And again, not in a million years would you have put this together. They were lost because something to do with wine. They abused the bottle. They drank too much, they got drunk, they acted badly, something went terribly wrong as a result of some abuse of wine. So Rashi's telling you, embedded at the beginning of time, from the very beginning of the Noah story. Again, think of yourself as a reader in Rashi's generation. You're reading this in the year 1096, and terrible things are happening to the Jewish people, and you're feeling the burden of Galus and the diaspora, and you're wondering, what is this all about? And Rashi says, this is an old story. People make mistakes, and as a result of their mistakes, they get punished. And so if you want to do something right, don't fall into the same trap. And Rashi's giving a musar shmooze, right? He's telling people in this moment, don't abuse the bottle. Look what happens. This wasn't a once in a lifetime story where a man called Noach made a terrible mistake and something tragic happened. This is a real life story because it happened to our parents and grandparents, and it's happening to us because we too are feeling the pain that they felt, the pain of being in the diaspora. And it's a result, it's a function of misbehavior, the same way that Noach misbehaved. Our grandparents made a similar mistake. Last comment I want to make. What is it that happened in this story? Right? It's so opaque. Right? There's something that Ham did that was so terrible that he gets cursed for generations, and his son gets cursed. What is it? The fact that he saw something he wasn't supposed to see? Okay, maybe that's a violation of privacy. That's not advisable. But it warrants such a severe punishment. Why? Is there something more to the text? And Rashi says, yeah, there's something more to the text. You wouldn't know it. Let me fill you in. Verse 22. Vayar Cham avi Canaan, Rashi's parish. Yesh meraboseinu omrim Canaan ra'a v'higid la'aviv lakach huskar al hadavar v'niskalem. Maybe he saw something. Or vayar es arvas aviv yesh omrim sirso v'yesh omrim reva'o. Wow. Now we've just moved to an entirely different level of magnitude of sin. Two explanations as to what went on behind the scenes. Either, what did Ham do to his father? Castrated his father, or he raped his father. Wow. Okay, this is the part that we skip in grade school. What is going on? What is Rashi alluding to? So there's a little bit of a trap, and that's why I say, right, you could spend so much time, and it's such a worthy exercise to go back to the sources. In this case, Rashi summarizes an entire paragraph in the Gemara into 6 words, and you have this super concise explanation of what happens here, and right, it changes the meaning of the entire text, and now we understand everything that follows, except that it's so short and so concise that it becomes difficult to understand unless you know where Rashi is getting this from. So let me take you for a second to the rest of the story that Rashi only gives you the first piece of. It's a Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Ayin Amud Aleph. And the Gemara says in source number 10, Vayikatz Noach mi'eino v'yidas asher asa lo b'no hakaton. He knew what his little son did. Rabu Shmuel, Machlokas Amarayim, Rav and Shmuel, we don't know who said which side, but we know it was the Machlokas between the two of them. Chad Amar Siso v'chad Amar Reva'o. One said castration, one said sodomy. Manda Amar Sarso. So where'd that come from? Right? You can't just make that up. Is there a basis for that in the text? Mitoch shakil kalo b'revi, kalulo b'revi. Mitoch shakil kalo b'revi, kalulo b'revi. Without getting into it, you'll see there's a medrash here that helps fill in the gaps. It's important to know the rest of the story. Noach cursed Canaan, who is the 4th son of Ham. There's a working assumption that the Torah always works midah keneged midah, measure for measure. Why would he have cursed the 4th son of Canaan? Because Ham was attempting to make sure that Noach did not have a 4th son of his own. By the way, that was the only command after the flood, and Noach failed to fulfill it, and this might be the reason why. God commanded all the inhabitants of the world post-flood, Pru-Revu, multiply, have more children. Shem, Cham, and Yafes fulfilled that command. Did Noach ever fulfill that command? Doesn't the Torah say he did everything God commanded? Why didn't he fulfill that command? This would be an explanation if, in fact, he was castrated by his son. Explanation number 1. Uman da'amar reva'o, gamar vayar ksiv hacha vayar cham avi Canaan eser v'asaviv, ksiv hasam vayar aso Shechem ben Chamor. Gzeira shava. This is a Talmudic rule that sometimes you have an unusual word that you wouldn't expect to find. What does it mean by yar? In this case, that he saw, it's bizarre. You can attach it to another place where that unusual word appears euphemistically, and they mean the same thing in both contexts. Where do we have this other unusual expression? Vayar cham avi Canaan eser v'asaviv. That's what we have in our parsha. And later on, Vayar osa Shechem ben Chamor. Right? What happens? The rape of Dinah. Cham in our parsha, Chamor, Shechem ben Chamor in the context of Yaakov's daughter. So the explanation of Vayar, sometimes it means to see, and occasionally it means to rape. Two explanations for what is happening in this text. Rashi gives us the headline, and if you go back to the source, right, you could understand everything that's happening. Okay. So again, there's so much here, and there's so much more to say. But what I hope that I've demonstrated is in even just these few psukim, what you see almost always throughout the context of Rashi's parish on the Torah and Tanakh, right? His dedication to being concise and making the text more readable. His moral relevance, right? In the middle of the Noach story, he gives a little sermon about the perils of drinking. He brings the text to life by filling in the gaps so that the text can be read, right, in a way that is even more compelling than the surface reading of the text. And the piece that I would add is the very nuanced and sophistication of the preservation of Chazal's interpretation of the text. So, right, the whole library is in front of him. The Gemara, the Talmud Bavli, and the Talmud Yerushalmi, and the Midrashim, and the Gaonim. And Rashi's going to pick. And he's going to give you one or two, a piece, a sliver, and he's going to weave together an explanation that is going to tell you, right, his best, most compelling interpretation of how 1,000 years of Jewish interpretation of this text makes meaning of what is happening. And that's the great contribution. That's the great contribution of Rashi. If you just had the Gemara, if you just have the Medrash, you might decide in some extreme manner, right? Maybe Noach is totally guiltless, or maybe Noach is totally guilty. And you read Rashi, and you have such a balanced, nuance, such a sophisticated understanding of the text. There's competing tensions. Noach's responsible, but not fully responsible. Noach is guilty, but not fully guilty. He's a tzaddik, but he's not a complete tzaddik. He has emunah, but not full emunah. And this is the final point. Rashi allows his reader to see him or herself reflected in the text because this is all of us, right? We're not mythic heroes from Greek mythology, right? We're not gods and demigods, nor are we, right, just totally wicked. We're people, and there are things we get right and the things we get wrong. We make good decisions, we make bad decisions, and we look at the text and we say, oh, this is our Masorah. This is always how it is. And if they have successes and failures, then we have successes and failures. At the end of the day, Hashem retains his great love for the Jewish people. There's always hope for redemption and improvement in spite of whatever may have gone wrong. Next week, please God, we'll pick up, I hope, with the Ramban. I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes to entertain questions, either in the chat or live. Thank you so much for joining. I wish everyone a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.